That seemed so long ago. Yet in reality, not even a full month had passed since they had first met. "Oh, don't worry yourself," Twindle said, drawing Lance from her thoughts, as she patted her shoulder reassuringly. "We don't think you're being greedy for wanting. The tools Tolak left behind would be better used serving our cause." Lance started, not sure if I would deserve such a thing. Her shoulders tensed as she spoke, staring over at the fallen body of Tolak, the chains gently snaking around on the stones, like loose roots seeking soil. The greed in her heart urged her to lash out for the chains, to shove Twindle aside to claim them for herself. That avarice dug a sickening pit of guilt in her heart, and she knew right then that she shouldn't be the one to take them. And who exactly deserves it? "The fiends," Alistair asked. "Better in our hands than theirs. Plus," Twindle interjected, "it isn't exactly a matter of deserving it, but whether or not the chains will choose to bond with you. Such creations have something of a soul of their own, if you can believe it." Lance's lips pursed. "So then I just need to have the same mentality as an evil fiend, and the chains will bind to me," she said sarcastically, shaking her head. "Perhaps they will choose none of us." "You don't have to be evil," Elum said sharply. "One just needs to possess a personality trait that it favors." "That's not what I heard," Alistair countered. "You must be, for lack of better words, aligned with the item. The Aether have been all across Akulis, and have heard every single interpretation on how the bonding takes place. But our reasoning trumps all others, in my experience." Elum sneered, though when he spoke, there was no heat in his tone. And what would that be, if the soul within the creation thinks you'll use it for its intended purpose? Alistair replied, crossing his arms. "Think of a magic spoon. You wouldn't use that in a fight, right? No, you'd use it to eat, of course. And that's what the soul would. I hesitate to say want, but that is the word that comes to mind. Bonding is based on intent alone, not morality or personality. It is preposterous." "I don't agree," Twindle replied. "At least, not completely. During my time in Akandar, I've seen bondings take place where the wielder had no plans on using the items in their intended fashion, and oftentimes they would end up using them in ways alien to most folk." "I'd say you were trying to be contrary," Alistair said with a huff, "but I know you hate that kind of thing. Truth is, no one knows for a fact what the requirements for a successful bonding are." "I know how to successfully bond with those chains," Elum said with a smirk, his hand finally leaving his graying arm as he stood up straight. "They will come to me like a puppy to a child once they see how devilishly handsome I am. Once they see how devilishly handsome I am. One. But you're ugly, and the chains don't have eyes," Alistair said, his brow furrowing in faux thought. "Village lasses love me," Elum replied with a snort. "I'm a bright red forbidden fruit, and that burns you." "Barrel, Bavstrow," Alistair shot back smartly. "I'm a white red forbidden foot. Shut up," he mocked, pitching his voice higher as he grinned. As the two matched their wits, Lance looked to Twindle, who was glaring at the two men like an irate mother. Eventually, she sighed, looking defeated as her eyes once again shifted to Lance. "Let us leave them to it," she said, turning to face the body of Tolak. "Honestly, they've both seen 19 winters, but they still act half their age. Apparently, boys don't become men until they reach their 30s. At least, That has been my experience. For elven men, it's when they reach their hundreds. She laughed, quietly, truthfully, though I'm not sure men ever stop being boys. That hasn't been my experience. Oh? Twindle asked as they finally reached the body. Lance struggled to maintain the sudden good humor she'd felt at seeing Elam and Alistair argue, but seeing the splattered remains of Tolek's head dashed against the bridge made that difficult. Still, though, she tried. To be fair, she said, prying her eyes away from the gory mess, girls never really become women either. Not until they reach their thousands. Yeah. Twindle replied after a moment, kneeling by the wriggling chains. Their thousands, of course, she said flatly, nodding. Lance felt her lips purse against her will, face growing hot with embarrassment, if they are an elf. She clarified. All women that aren't elves are doomed to stay girls for their entire lives, then. Twindle asked with a laugh. Of course not, Lance said sharply. It is relative to the race's total lifespan. Well, I can't argue with that, she replied. Anyway, I'll need to grab both of the chains to properly identify. Athena willing, I'll be able to determine if they bear the curse. I've never fully learned how it is that you spellcasters identify such things, come to think of it. Lance said, would you mind clarifying? No offense, but Twindle started, hesitating. Aren't you over 200? I'm sure you've had to have learned about this by now. She giggled, waving a dismissive hand. You can live for 200,000 years, and still not know everything there is to learn. Forgive the ignorance of this wretched old hag. Just this once. My apologies, you do make a fair point, I think. Twindle said after another moment of brief hesitation. You see, a caster does not communicate with the object directly. There needs to be a sort of mediating party, usually in the form of an angel. So Baumil could tell us about the chains. Why not just call him over here? Lance asked. It would spare you the effort of summoning one yourself. It is not that simple. She said, see, Baumil isn't that type of angel. Most aren't visible or even have form. Battle angels such as he are an exception to that rule. That's right. Alistair said he and Elam apparently finished with their spat. Baumil doesn't reside in the astral plane between Akulis and the realm of the pillars. He'd be unable to tell us anything about it. You would need an angel that exists solely within the astral realm, one that could force a temporary bond between itself and a magic item. For Twindle, Elam cut in, that would need to be an angel of Athena, as her magic exclusively draws foundation through Athena's pillar. I think I understand. Lance said, now, if we find that the chains don't bear the curse, who will be the one to try and wield them first? She asked, her eyes darting to the gently writhing chains. If she had something like that, he wouldn't call her useless again. No one would. But she couldn't bear the thought of degrading herself by proclaiming her want for them. She would be patient and wait her turn. May. Elam said, gently jabbing a thumb into his chest. I know exactly the kind of spells that would work perfectly with animated chains. That, and they would add to my innate charm, enhance my free devil look. Could you be any more foppish? Alistair asked. Free devil, huh? Sounds like you really are that fruit you claim to be. Coming from the one with daisy hair, now stand back and watch a master at work. Elam declared, taking a step toward the body. Not yet. Twindle shouted, I haven't even begun to identify. Stay back until I'm done. The three then entered into further chatter as she looked back toward Hoplite, who now seemed to be speaking with Kitka, Michael still at his side. She wondered what they could be talking about. Likely Hoplite was asking Kitka what exactly this mouth of Zod was. She certainly hadn't heard about it. She looked away again, noting that the angel Baumio was nowhere in sight. Neither was Siopalu for that matter, but the old codger was probably still sleeping in the wagon. No mystery there. No mystery for Baumio either. Alistair could dismiss the being at will. She'd need to try and talk to the angel when she found the time. Lance was sure that he would have some incredible stories to tell. An angel that served the pillars couldn't possibly belt out anything boring, that was for sure. No curse. Twindle said suddenly, drawing her attention once again. She needed to stop getting so lost in her own thoughts and start concentrating on the now. It was irritating to get constantly drawn out of her headspace. There was plenty of time for thought when everyone else was asleep. Twindle unhanded the chains, letting them flop back to the stone with a gentle clatter, to where they resumed their lazy wriggling. "All right, good," Elam said, rubbing his hands together. "Let's see if these things have some sense." He took each chain in a hand, holding them aloft triumphantly for a minute straight. "See, I have been chosen," he declared. "Now watch as I use these chains to throw Alistair into the shot." Alistair gripped his hammer, face tensing a moment before he released the grip. "I'm just joking. These things don't seem to care for me much," Elam said with a shrug, dropping them to the ground. "Their loss, honestly. They don't seem to realize how perfect we would be together." "Of course they wouldn't choose a fop," Alistair said, smirking. "Watch this, Sir Forbidden Fruit." With that, Alistair gripped the ends of the chains, holding them at hip height while humming an unfamiliar tune. Another minute passed, then another, before Alistair frowned, gently letting the chains back down to the stone before crossing his arms with a hug. "Well, that's just not fun," he said, scratching his chin. "I'm going to go see what Kitka and the others are up to, see if any of them want a shot at claiming these for themselves." "Could you imagine Hoplite with these things?" he asked. Lance paled at the thought. He was already the most dangerous warrior she'd ever witnessed. If he had these chains, too, she doubted that anything would be able to stop him. Well, except maybe Kazan, or the Dragon of the East. Perhaps she should let him try. But that would only make his shadow even larger. No, she'd be the one to try next. Besides, he may not even want to try and take them. She could imagine it now. Negative. The magic will give me brain parasites, and that would make this mission suboptimal, something like that. That is, unless Twindle wanted to have a go. "You were the one who took the time to identify them. You should have a try before me," Lance said, urging the half-elf toward the chains. "No, I am quite all right. I was planning on trying it last, to tell the truth. Chains," she hesitated. "Chains make me uncomfortable." Lance understood. Twindle had grown up as a half-elf in Umont of all places. She was lucky she'd only been clasped in chains instead of being fully clipped. Curiosity nearly nudged her into asking an inappropriately personal question, so she suppressed it. Lance would not pry about Twindle's upbringing, not if it would hurt her to talk about it. If the paladin wished it, she would tell Lance, and she'd leave it at that. "Very well," Lance said, taking a deep breath as she stared at the chains. For an instant they seemed as dangerous as vipers. What if Twindle had gotten a bad reading back from her angelic contact? Would she become cursed anyway? Had she even identified them properly? Lance hadn't seen any flashes of light or any form of chanting. Twindle had simply knelt down and held the chains for him. Surely that couldn't be enough to determine if they were harmless. Yet she had no reason to distrust Twindle's judgment. She did not seem the type to let something like that slip past her. She'd have faith in her friend, and if she did end up cursed, well, Alistair could always summon the golden flame. Pushing those dour thoughts from her mind, she gingerly reached down, hands grasping the surprisingly cold chains before she lifted them into the air. A minute passed of the chains gently wriggling in her grasp, then another, until finally she despaired that nothing felt different. Was there supposed to be something special that happened during a bonding? Lance was certain that there was, yet she felt nothing. Would she continue to be powerless for this journey? A hindrance to Hoplite and the others. Her teeth clenched, and she found her hands gripping the metal tightly. No. She'd not hold this party back from their goals, even if these wretched things refused to bond to her. Lance would become powerful without them. Power would be hers. She went to throw the chains down to the stone, but she found that they wouldn't come off. Chapter 14. Silence. Lance and the others left his side, approaching the downed form of Tolek, with Elam, Alistair, and Twindle. Were they going to try and seize those chains after all? The advantages of having them might prove beneficial to the squad, but it was risky to try and take something like that. What if it could spread the curse, or even worse, allow Kazon to directly control their minds? That would be suboptimal to the completion of the mission. He thought of commanding them to leave the chains behind, but they were not his subordinates. If they desired to take the chains, he would allow them to try. Yet, if his worries came to fruition, well, if they became possessed, then he would do what needed to be done. Then everyone would move on. Turning his attention away from those dire thoughts, he tilted his helmet toward Kitka and asked, "Hom is the tongue of Zod. What does that entail?" "The mouth of Zod is supposed to be our contact with Zod himself," Kitka explained. "A chunk of his very tongue is grafted to their flesh, usually within their chests." That would explain the tumorous growth Hoplite had seen protruding from Hom's chest. A piece of a pillar god's tongue. How would inserting something like that provide a means to communicate with Zod? He asked Kitka this very question, to which the man simply shrugged in response. "I don't know." "Pillar magic?" Kitka asked. "I'm not too sure. Wait, he stuttered. "I meant not too sure, sorry." "Man," Michael sighed. "Fella, you seriously gotta relax. I think you'd be better at talking if you weren't so stressed out." "I'm not stressed," Kitka replied. "I'm completely calm." He corrected. "Then what's your issue? Are you tweaking?" Michael asked, brow quirked. Hoplite's brow furrowed at the term, tweaking. Did he mean that as in adjustment? What was Kitka tweaking exactly? His speech. Kitka didn't seem to know what the term meant either, for his face scrunched up in apparent perplexion. "Never mind. Just do you, man," Michael said with an urging gesture. "Alrighty then," Kitka replied. The tongue in Hom apparently hasn't completed its transformation. He struggled. "What would it transform into exactly?" Hoplite asked. "An extra organ?" "No, Apparently, it will become some kind of jewelry that the mouth can wear, but Ham-Holm has had it for over 200 years, and it still hasn't changed, he said, his tone almost becoming wistful. I think it might have something to do withful. I think it might have something to do with the curse. Hoplite nodded. That makes sense. But if that's true, there'll never be a mouth again. Not unless it's removed. Yes, Kitka said, firming his features. I'll talk to him about it the next time I see him. Affirmative, he said, his attention drawn away to a sudden shout. Elam had apparently shrugged away from Twindle and was looking seriously angered. Was he going to become aggressive? Was Kazan's influence piercing through Twindle's aura? Maybe not. She did say that her aura would only cancel out Kazan's magic, not that it would suppress normal emotions. His finger twitched toward the fortis attached to his thigh plate, a movement that only he himself was aware of. If Elam lashed out, then Hoplite would have to shoot to kill. He had no non-lethal options at this range. If Elam wasn't so dangerous, he wouldn't have considered killing him. But his magic could kill all those immediately surrounding him, well before anything could be done about it. There was a chance that he could be brought back to sanity if he could be restrained. But again, that would require serious risk to those adjacent to Elam. He wouldn't let Lance die like that. Nolvi wasn't far behind her. She could potentially incapacitate Elam as well. But again, there was the risk that she wouldn't be fast enough to react. Thankfully, though, his worries seemed to be unfounded, for Elam soon eased up and began to banter with Alistair. From what Hoplite could hear, he hadn't wanted his gray arm to be touched. Was it sensitive? What are they talking about, sir? Michael asked, biting his cheek. Elam didn't want his arm being touched. Hoplite told him, and now he and Alistair are acting unprofessional. Michael grimaced. I don't blame the guy. I wouldn't want to touch that thing either. Should probably just cut the whole dang thing off. I think it's spreading. You can hear that far, Hoplite? Kitka asked. I can barely even hear. Sorry. Hear them, much less understand what they're saying. My ears are enhanced by bionics. Hoplite replied. Is that some kind of magic from your world? He asked. How do you cast bionics? No, man. Michael laughed. It ain't magic. It's, he hesitated. It's robot stuff. Kitka merely stared blankly in reply and didn't say anything. Was he trying to make out what the term robot meant? All right. He's got special metal in his ears, what lets him hear better. Michael said with a firm nod. Get it? Oh yeah, Kitka said, nodding back. That makes sense, so magic metal. Yeah, Michael replied with a sigh. Think of it more like living metal. Hoplite said, rather than magical. There is no magic in our dimension. Living metal, Kitka said in a clearly confused tone. No magic in your world? How can metal be alive if you have no magic? It doesn't make sense. He shouted suddenly, apparently frustrated. Magic don't make sense. Michael shouted back. Hoplite ignored their pointless argument, instead turning his attention back to what Lance and the others were doing. Alistair had just set down the chains. Apparently, they had decided not to bond with him. Having listened into their conversation from this distance, he surmised that the item had a particular type of person it would desire. A very strange process, to say the least. But his time on Akulis has eroded his will to question such occurrences. He was unsure if he should be concerned about this or not. But before he could decide, he saw Lance move over to the chains. He almost ran over there to pull her away from them, but he felt that would be an unwise decision for some reason. Twindle did say that they wouldn't transfer the curse, and Alistair's earlier claims corroborated this. Should he really allow Lance to take this risk, though? What if Alistair and Twindle were wrong and Lance became infected? A pit then formed in his gut, worry eating down the back of his neck as emptiness began to fill him. He clenched his teeth and forced the pointless feelings from his mind as Lance finally lifted the chains, wrapping them around her forearms before lifting them into the air. Sunset bathed her dark form in an orange hue, the contrast nearly making her appear as a black pillar in the light. A few moments passed, with nothing seeming to happen while Lance stood there with the chains, her back to him. Eventually she leaned down, trying to put the chains back to the stone. But after a few shakes, it was clear that the metal links refused to be put back down. They had chosen their new master. Hoplite darted over as fast as he could, the cascade of his rapidly approaching footsteps causing Lance and the others nearby to jump in shock. "Are you all right?" Hoplite asked quickly. "Do you feel any symptoms? It hasn't been a full minute yet. We can still get them removed." He had closed the distance between them by only a few seconds. Perhaps his sudden appearance by their side was what shocked them so. "By the pillars!" she shouted, nearly falling on her rear as he came upon her. "Calm yourself. I feel fine." The length of the chains stretched all the way to Tolak's arms, which seemed to be detaching themselves from the fallen fiend's limbs as they snaked their way toward Lance. His hand lashed out to seize them before they could fully wrap around her, but they evaded his grasp, their speed not at all diminished by Tolak's death. "I'm fine. Let them be," Lance shouted, slapping at his shoulder plate. "Really, I'm okay." He hesitated for a brief instant before complying with her request. Her skin wasn't purpling. Spirals weren't etching themselves into her flesh. It seemed as if all would be well. Yet this urge still persisted within him. He desired to remove these chains before they could fully attach to her. It wasn't because he wanted them for himself, that was for sure. Was he overreacting? And if so, why? He eased back, letting Lance stand to her feet as the chains continued to snake their way to her, rising and wrapping around her forearms in thick bundles. He held himself at the ready to remove them the instant Lance showed any symptoms of turning. But none came, at least. None that were obvious. Eventually, the chains completed their wrapping, completely coiled up around her forearms, leaving no slack. She held them close to her face, pursing her lips and scrunching her brow. "You don't look glad," Hoplite pointed out. She started. "I'm just worried about why they chose me." "Well," Twindle said, "it doesn't really matter. They're yours now. All that matters is what you intend to do with them. Are you planning to do evil?" she asked, putting her hands on her hips as she stared at Lance. When she didn't get an answer, she continued, "I thought not. You certainly don't seem the type. I just wanted—" She hesitated, the words dying on her tongue. "I wanted to keep myself safe." Those green eyes of hers shifted nervously as she said that. Wait, could it be possible that she had just lied? Twindle nodded. "That could be it. Self-preservation, perhaps. It's sensible, not something to feel guilty over. Don't think too hard on it, or you may have a hard time sleeping." Twindle stopped herself. I guess I mean next week, when you do actually have to sleep." "I'll be fresh for a long while yet," Lance said with a mirthless laugh. "I simply need to process this, and, well, I suppose I should take the time to learn how to use these." she said, lifting her arms to display them. By the pillars, they're heavy. Just because they're magic doesn't mean they'll be light as a feather. Twindle said, you can probably mitigate it by unfurling them. They seem to be able to handle their own weight. I'm just imagining how inconvenient these are going to make basic tasks. She said, climbing is going to be harder. Hiding will be harder. Everything's going to be more difficult. But you'll be more optimal for use on the field. Hoplite stated they're fast enough to block bullets. They should keep you relatively safe from now on. That's right, Lance said flatly, taking that into account. I don't want you telling me that I won't be useful ever again. He blinked. That wasn't what he had said. He had just stated the clear fact that she wasn't needed for the conflict, that she wouldn't have changed anything. All she would have done was hinder him had she joined him in the fight against Tolak. And it was more than likely that she'd have been cursed or killed. The others had all gathered around by now, all save for Balmio and Theopalu, of course. Should he clarify what he had actually said to her? It didn't seem like that would cause friction. He hadn't said she was useless. That isn't what I told you, he said in his monotone. I said that you wouldn't have changed anything, because you wouldn't have. Suddenly, everything fell silent. Twindle held a closed fist to her mouth, staring wide-eyed at both he and Lance. Elam and Alistair both sucked air through their teeth, breaking the silence for a brief instant while Kidka put a hand over his eyes. Nolvi, as always, didn't seem to react one way or another. Michael, though, blew air out of his lips and shook his head, a tight grimace forming on his face. It appeared that had been the wrong thing to say, but how? It was the truth. He felt the heat of frustration beginning to creep up his neck before he forced it back down, steadying his breath as he did so. Lance didn't say anything, simply pivoting on her heels and walking away, back towards the rest stop. He blinked in surprise at this. He'd expected biting retorts and shouting, not this. The silence continued until Lance finally disappeared into the tunnel, completely out of earshot. Sir Dot. Michael said, permission to speak freely? Granted, he said after a moment. All righty then, he said before taking a deep breath. You hurt her feelings, sir. Hurt her feelings. How in Jin's name did he hurt her feelings? It had been the simple truth he'd given her. Why did that make her so angry? Frustration began bubbling up again, the heat seeming to build up in his face, yearning for a release. But before he could shove it back down and rein it in with cold discipline, Twindle said in a tone bordering on scolding, you really need to learn to watch what you say. Could you not have worded that more nicely? I didn't ask for your opinion, Hoplite said sharply, letting the fires of his frustration free, his helmet quickly tilting in her direction. I suppose you didn't. Good day, Twindle replied flatly, before she too took her leave, heading straight towards the rest stop. Everyone else, save for Michael, followed after her, not turning to look at him as they went. The frustration continued to build as he watched them walk away, unsure as to how to proceed. Michael, strangely enough, looked increasingly uncomfortable, his feet shifting as his eyes apparently found something interesting in the sky. Even his own subordinates seemed to be wishing to be elsewhere. And this too added to the anger Hoplite felt. Yet, now that there was this moment of silence, he took that time to rein in his useless emotions. Once the heat of his anger cooled, he said, go with them private. I'm going to keep watch for a while. You sure, sir? Michael asked, We could talk some more about, what just happened. If you want. Negative. Hoplite replied. He needed time alone to think about what had just happened, and Michael shouldn't stay out here as the sunlight receded. The others would be lighting up the interior of the rest stop, and he had his flashlight to keep the dark at bay. Copy that, sir. Michael replied, promptly jogging over to the tunnel right as Twindle entered. Once they were all out of sight, Hoplite's head hung back, staring at the orange sky as he thought. He hadn't expected her to react that way, yelling maybe, but complete and utter silence. For some strange reason, it unsettled him. Chapter 15. Neil Twindle sighed as she rounded the corner into the tunnel. She saw Lance already far ahead of her, quickly moving right past the wagon and further into the darkness. She would likely need some time to herself to cool down, just as Hoplite. It had been strange, and admittedly a tad bit terrifying to hear the Outworlder lose his temper that way. He was normally cold and stiff, almost like a statue that had become animate. To hear that heat in his voice was deeply unsettling. It wasn't the same as when they were on the wagon. When he shouted back then, she knew that it was due to Kazan's influence. With Twindle canceling out that vile magic, that meant that his anger had been genuine. She didn't think he'd be offended by her mild scolding, at least not to that level. So, are you angry with him too? Alistair asked, quickly walking up beside her. Not at all, Twindle said honestly, but I suspect Hoplite is the kind of man that needs space when he gets frustrated, so I didn't wish to stay. Makes sense, he replied. How long do you think he'll be out there? I'm guessing only a few minutes, he shrugged, but with him, who really knows? Should we talk to Lance? Or you, I mean, Alistair said, nodding towards the Watchers retreating back. I don't think it's a good idea to let that one stew. I'm intrigued to see that you care, Twindle replied, her tone genuine. Alistair frowned. This is a dangerous trip. We can't have the party tearing itself apart. Sure, they aren't really part of our group, but right now we're sticking together, and these kinds of fractures can't be left to worsen. I'm impressed, Twindle said, again in an honest tone. I'm happy to see this side of you. She finished with a smile. Alistair's lips pulled into a tight line. I don't care. Not in that way, at least, he explained. But it would be foolish to let this fester. Best we resolve this as soon as possible. That's wise, Ellum said, pulling up beside them with a nod. Such a dire mood has a habit of spreading to others as well. Imagine if all of us were behaving that way at the same time. We wouldn't have survived this long. It's hard to be apathetic, Kitka stuttered behind them, to people who've had your back for years. Hoplite and Lance haven't known each other for nearly as long as I've known you. Dire moods can still spread, and keep in mind that the heat of anger can evaporate years of friendship if left to cook. Nolvi commented in a passive tone from behind Kitka. That might be the longest sentence I've heard from you. Alistair laughed. Special occasion. After a long moment of silence, Alistair waved a dismissive hand. Guess we'll talk again next year, he said with a mild grimace. Twindle and the others passed the wagon finally, and she saw that Lance had come to a complete stop at the far end of the chamber, her back to them. Twindle began walking faster, putting up a hand to dissuade the others from following after her. Once she was certain that the party was remaining by the wagon, she pulled up beside Lance, gently placing a hand on the Watcher's shoulder. Some people are very unaware of the effect their words can have on others, Twindle explained. Him least of all, it would seem. It isn't really his fault, Lance said, her tone low. He's socially stunted. His parents must have been the same way, I'm guessing. How a child is brought up significantly impacts how they interact with others. She replied with a nod. Once he cools down, I'll try and talk with him again. He wasn't raised by anyone except his world's military. Lance explained, interrupting Twindle. He was taught that he was a tool, not a person. A tool doesn't care about how their words would affect others. It only cares about what it's supposed to do. Twindle paled at this revelation. Hoplite had been raised to think of himself not as a human being. How cruel did the other realm have to be in order to drain the life out of a child that way? A mote of hot fury began to build in her heart at the thought, but she quickly extinguished it. Anger could not be allowed to fester within her, not when she was trying to bring tranquility. It would taint the peace. He might say that he's little more than a tool, but that doesn't change what he really is. He is a man, no matter what he says. Twindle said, firming her features, a tool doesn't have emotion, and the anger he displayed earlier is proof of that. I heard that when I was walking away. He's been getting a lot less. Lance hesitated, a lot less cold lately. Maybe that's why his words stung so much. She paused for a long while, her face contorting into an intense grimace. No. No. No.